Connecticut's congressional delegation is fully behind the 5-year reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act that provides more than $600 million a year to help women who have been victimized. However, that doesn't mean Connecticut domestic violence advocates are sitting on the sidelines, relying on other state congressional leaders to do the same. Karen Jarmoc is executive director of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and she is going to travel to Washington, D.C. on June 4th to help push for support. Karen, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about, first of all, how this helps women here in Connecticut.
Sure. It helps women in Connecticut in a whole host of ways, and actually very concrete ways. The Violence Against Women Act actually funds a grant that we have for law enforcement. We have a law enforcement coordinator coming on board for our statewide coalition who will be working cooperatively with law enforcement across the state of Connecticut. The Legal Assistance to Victims grant, which provides legal aid to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in those very high-risk cases. Connecticut's 18 child advocates who work in the 18 shelters across our state are funded through this Violence Against Women Act.
So what happens if it doesn't go through?
Well, it's very concerning. You know, all of those services then will be at risk, and obviously victims of domestic violence and sexual assault will be at serious risk. So
what would even be your first step?
Well, you know, thankfully, I think there's a Senate version that's passed in the Senate and a House version. We obviously prefer the Senate version. It really protects all victims. And so there is, I think, an impetus to support this. It's just a question of in what way. And so I'm going to Washington on June 4th, and my counterparts from across the country are doing the same to talk with members of Congress and the U.S. Senate about the importance of this act.
And the battle there really is over people who do not feel it's appropriate to include certain specific groups, including
I think immigrant populations,
undocumented people. I mean, that's really what the crux of the debate is, right?
Yeah, that's some of the crux of the debate, correct. And there's just, you know, we obviously believe in protection for all victims of domestic violence, of sexual assault, regardless of your sexual orientation or whether you're a Native American or not a Native American. And so I am going to Washington to work with my counterparts to push for the Senate version of this bill.
And those are groups that are traditionally underserved?
Yeah, absolutely. Very underserved populations and sometimes fearful to seek help. And so we want to ensure that the protections are there through these grant initiatives to protect all victims of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Those are such polarizing issues, though. I mean, do you think that, it's gridlocked now. I mean, how confident are you that there will be a breakthrough?
Yeah, I'm confident that our elected officials care enough about this important issue. I mean, when the Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994, since that time frame, incidents of domestic violence have actually decreased by 50%.
Wow.
And so when you see those kinds of statistics, even in Connecticut, we're looking at 54,000 victims of domestic violence served here in Connecticut by our 18 programs annually. And so when they see those types of statistics, I think they will be moved enough to support some measures that really protect victims.
So you'll be doing what specifically when you're down there? Meeting with other state leaders?
Well, I'll probably be meeting with our state leaders, members of Congress, U.S. Senate, and then also having some policy meetings with my counterparts from across the country.
Interesting. I know that in the last legislative session here in Connecticut, there were a few bills up, and I'm wondering what kind of progress was made, do you think?
Oh, gosh, there was great progress made. Representative May Flexer, who chairs the Speaker's Task Force on Domestic Violence, was such a leader in getting this an act concerning domestic violence passed. Now there's a model policy for all law enforcement to follow when protecting victims of domestic violence. Restraining orders used to be for up to 6 months. Now they're up to 1 year as of October 1st, which was really critical for our statewide coalition to get that measure passed so that victims have that protection. They're not having to go back after a few months to try to get the order in place again. It can be very traumatizing and difficult.
And also allow, I would imagine, a little time for the situation to play itself out, I guess.
Sure, to things to calm down, but the important thing is to have that protection in place for those victims who need them, who are at that highest risk.
And I was just reading that now there's going to be a reconsideration, and there was a pilot program that used GPS monitoring for offenders, and now there's going to be a reconsideration of applying it statewide, or?
Well, there was a really successful pilot program which utilized ARRA funds, which were temporary federal funding, and it was proven to really protect those victims of domestic violence who are at the very highest risk of being at risk of homicide. And so we are working cooperatively with those other groups that are really interested in seeing if we can get in some type of creative way. We know the budget's tight, but is there a way to get some funding in place to help keep that program going? Because it's expired at this point. It was temporary funding. It was a pilot program.
Is that federal funding tied up in this act as well, or
no? It was just, it's called ARA money. It's just,
okay.
It was temporary monies, stimulus monies, and it was utilized for that purpose to do the pilot program.
Interesting. So. What should people do if they want to support your? Is there anything that people can do at this point
Sure.
to support your efforts?
I would say they can contact our members of Congress. We have 5 members of Congress, and also both of our U.S. senators. They are on board with the Senate version of this bill, but it's always important for them to hear from constituents and how important it is. Again, we're talking about 54,000 victims annually served in our state. You know, we can expect on any given day over 300 victims to be in shelters across Connecticut. That's huge.
Is that number going down? You mentioned.
No, it's not going down. We're not seeing it increase significantly, but we are just seeing a steady number that is served annually here in Connecticut. You know, 1/3 of all family violence criminal court cases, or 1/3 of all the cases in our criminal courts are family violence incidents and arrests.
Was it affected at all? I know that I'd read a few things saying that often the economy can have an effect on these kinds of situations.
Well, you know, we've been in a tough recession. We've absolutely seen an increase in our numbers, but not a huge uptick. I mean, obviously the economy does play a role in terms of creating more stress, and that can create violence and that sort of thing. But we're not seeing an enormous increase. We're seeing a steady number. We'd love to see that number go down. I mean, even in Connecticut over the past decade, we average 16 homicides a year. We absolutely don't want that to be our state statistic.
Absolutely. Karen, we wish you good luck as you head to D.C., and thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having.
Don't forget, if you missed something here on The Real Story, you can now watch it online by going to ctnow.com. You can also catch us on YouTube. Thanks for watching this week's edition of The Real Story. We'll see you here again next week.